Sure. Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out. This is night school for those of you who are old hats and new hats. This is the North Brooklyn Socialist Night School. We meet bi-weekly every other Monday night to do three things that socialists ought to do. We believe first, clarify our values, what we stand for, what we're fighting for. Second, sharpen our analysis. So we better understand why the world does not match our values in so many ways, why it is, and what the barriers are to making that world more egalitarian, more free, and more rich with leisure and pleasure and all the good things in life, as opposed to, being on the precipice of despair and destruction. So we sharpen our analysis, we clarify our values, and then we orient ourselves towards action, towards changing the world. We want to be smart socialists and active socialists who are actively engaged in the issues of our time, which couldn't be more urgent. And with snowstorms in Texas that are throwing the entire energy grid out of whack and killing people, what better to talk about than the Green New Deal, and who better to talk about it with than THEA RIOFRANCOS, who we're really thrilled to have with us. Just briefly by way of introduction, Thea is a political scientist and a professor. She's the author of Resource Radicals and the co-author of the reading for today, A Planet to Win. A great little book, readable, excellent, as many of you have found. And on the Green New Deal campaign committee for DSA. So also very active in our collective work to make the Green New Deal a reality, which I'm sure she'll be telling us about, both her analytical work and practical political work in what we're working on today. So I couldn't be more excited. Thank you so much, Thea, for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for coming out this evening. It's amazing to see so many people in a night school. So congrats to the organizers for doing such a good job with turnout and with coordinating these events. So hi everybody, I'm THEA RIOFRANCOS, as was said, and I sit on the National Green New Deal Campaign Committee, and some of you I've interacted with around Green New Deal work and eco-socialist work in the organization, and around international work as well. So it's nice to see some familiar faces here. I don't have like a long scripted prepared talk, and I don't necessarily think that those are the most interesting in an interactive way. So I'm going to say some words. I'll try to keep my comments relatively brief. And then what I'm most interested in general with Green New Deal events is like what people are thinking about, like what questions people have around what the Green New Deal might mean, what policies might kind of count as Green New Deal policies, how we should be fighting for them, what the strategy is. I'm also happy to share, as I'll note in a moment in my comments, what we've been working on nationally. I put that in quotes because we do all our national work through work with chapter level leaders, right? So it's a lot of there's a lot of exciting developments happening with our soon to be launched Green New Deal campaign. So in DSA, so I'm happy to kind of go that strategic route. I'm also happy to talk more as well about like my research on extractive frontiers, on resource extraction, and how that relates to the Green New Deal. So we could go a lot of different directions. I'm curious how folks want to take it in the conversation. But let me just start with some kind of basics. I don't like to assume that people know or share the same definitions of concepts that that many of us might use, but I think it's good to have some kind of shared reference points. So I want to just start with like what the Green New Deal means to me, but I think in a more collective sense means to my co-authors as well of A Planet to Win, and also the comrades that I work with in DSA on Green New Deal campaigns. So when we think about the Green New Deal, I think first and foremost, the way to the sort of point of departure is to think of it as a set of climate policies in the same way that the New Deal we could think of as like a set of social policies, right? It's not just one policy, it's many policies that will hopefully be enacted over time. And what's unique about the Green New Deal, I would say, compared to any other prior climate policy or competing, climate policy framework out there is that it is aimed precisely at the intersection of the climate crisis and the crisis of socioeconomic inequality. And I think though that those two crises are interconnected and also accelerating in their harmful effects is unfortunately and tragically like more and more apparent every day that passes, right? We're seeing what is happening to communities across Texas right now. Recently we saw what was happening to communities across the Western United States with wildfires. We've seen record hurricanes. I mean, I probably don't need to go onto this list that many people have heard many times, but the climate crisis is clearly accelerating, which just is clear increasingly even in mainstream reporting, but definitely in socialist spaces like this, is that the climate crisis is deeply unequal in its effects, and it's deeply unequal in a way that is deeply unjust in the sense that those who are most responsible and most complicit in causing the climate crisis, whether we think of that in terms of the ruling class, whether we think of that in terms of the 1% income wise, or whether we think of it in terms of some of the specific corporations, especially fossil fuel, but not exclusively, that have caused most of the emissions, those groups are directly inverse to the groups that are suffering its worst effects, right? So those that are least responsible are most vulnerable, and those that are most responsible are least vulnerable. So it is a classic question of the climate crisis poses classic questions of kind of social justice and injustice. And so the Green New Deal recognizes all these realities, which are just empirical facts about the climate crisis and about how it's connected to inequality across the world. I think another unique aspect of the Green New Deal, in addition to that, it takes inequality very seriously, is that it doesn't see climate as like this distinct realm of politics, or distinct kind of issue area. So like we have climate and then we have all the other issue areas. Instead, it kind of sees how climate is imbricated in every area of social life, which again completely accords with the climate science, but is something that unfortunately kind of liberal and mainstream versions of climate policy just like refused to recognize previously. They kind of thought of climate as something that was cordoned off, and that maybe it was even better to not connect it to other issues for fear of it getting kind of bogged down in other types of politics. And what we've seen is the opposite, that people actually don't really get excited about emissions, like just like the word emissions or the word carbon. What people get politically excited about is understanding how the climate crisis affects them, personally, in their lived experience, but also that the solutions to the climate crisis might actually make their lives better. So that's the kind of third piece of the Green New Deal, is that the Green New Deal, as like in sort of thinking about it as policy interventions, are policies that do two things at once. They address the climate crisis and they improve the material well-being of working class communities and communities of color that have suffered the most harm, not just of the climate crisis, but other crises like the pandemic, of course. So those are kind of three pieces of how I would define the Green New Deal. And I think what's kind of immediately exciting about the Green New Deal, from a socialist perspective and an eco-socialist perspective, is that it opens up like all of these terrains of organizing, right? So if like the climate crisis is not just something for like technocratic wonks to deal with like, kind of fiddling with the carbon price or the carbon tax, if it's something that is connected to everything we do, if the buildings that we live in are part of the problem of producing emissions, if the transit that we use is part of the problem, if our energy grid, as we're seeing like dramatically and tragically in Texas, is part of the problem, then there are actually all of these very concrete material arenas that are immediately recognizable to ordinary people that we can start organizing in. It's like, okay, there's a housing crisis. Well, let's show how the housing crisis is connected to the climate crisis. And in the process, try to build, call on the city, the state, or the federal government to build a bunch of green social housing, right? So you kind of there's an intersectional analysis that like lends itself to politics and to political organizing in ways that I think are more palpable to people that are not already super politicized around climate. But I think like the flip side of that, and now I'm gonna move away from my very like optimistic and sunny depiction of the Green New Deal for a moment, because I think we should, as the sort of introduction that Jeremy gave, we should be real about where, how our analysis connects our goals and our aspirations to the realities on the ground, right? Just the fact that there are many potential arenas of climate politics that the Green New Deal kind of like sheds light on in a way, and that many different constituencies could benefit from Green New Deal type policies does not do our work for us. Like it doesn't actually stitch together those coalitions. It doesn't organize those people or politicize them. And so what the Green New Deal, I think, kind of shows is that, on the one hand, there's lots of interesting climate work to be done that's very rooted in a sort of working class politics that would lift up material conditions of most people. On the other hand, we are at a moment in US history, if we just look historically, that, for example, the labor movement is the weakest it's ever been. I mean, putting aside some amazing recent strike activity that I don't want to deny, but if you just look at the chart of like union density, it is a downward trajectory, right? And so we have this amazing opportunity to sort of organize around like a working class climate politics at the same time where like some of the basic institutions that collectively empower working class people to shape politics even beyond their workplaces are in tatters, right? And so that immediately invites like, how are we going to build the multiracial working class coalition, and where do socialists intervene in that process of political organizing that could actually create something like the decade of the Green New Deal? And I say decade because climate scientists tells us that we have actually now, unfortunately, a little under a decade to cut global emissions in half, right? So we have this like kind of time period to work with. So those are some of the core opportunities and I think super inspiring aspects of the Green New Deal, but also immediately pivots us to some of the organizational challenges of like, we know that ratepayers, for example, and utility workers might be two constituencies that would really benefit from a deep public investment to improve the grid. I'm thinking of Texas again, right? That they would benefit from a more equitable energy system that maybe had more power for the workers in it, right? We can sort of imagine these coalitions, but how do we actually do the work to connect the ratepayers, low-income ratepayers that are suffering astronomical energy bills with the utility workers that are suffering forms of exploitation and lack of safety at the workplace? Like those connections are not just given just because they're theoretically like would make sense, right? And so this is always the historic task of socialists, including in the more militant and more upswing kind of moments of the labor movement, is to actually do that work of politicizing and connecting and not assuming that just because people might have these interests, they will kind of embody them. So I am happy to speak to, if it's interesting to folks, to like what we're doing nationally in DSA. And like I said at the beginning, when I say nationally, I don't mean some like separate body that's just national. It's like a bunch of connections across chapters and with different leaders around the country. What we're thinking about with this Green New Deal campaign that we're about to launch. It'll launch publicly in like the first week of March, but we've already been doing a lot of the organizing work around it. So folks in this room that might be involved in the Eco-Socialist Working Group in New York, which is an amazing, I mean, you all are really amazing organizers coming out of New York City and have been pivotal to the national work. So I'm happy to share some of that. I don't know if I should, maybe I'll just actually ask Jeremy for a moment if I should like go down that route, because I could easily like kind of explain what we're thinking about with the DSA national campaign, get folks excited about it, drop the sign up sheet in I could do that work now. Or I could pivot to the other piece of my and my collaborators' work around resource extraction in the Green New Deal, which takes us to that global justice angle. And I could sort of leave for the moment the DSA strategy work and circle back to it when and if people have questions. But I'm not sure what you all normally do. So do you have a intuition, Jeremy? I'm happy to go either way with that.
Yeah, I was going to say both, which is showing up in the chat. That's not the easiest kind of answer though.
No, that's okay. I can do both. I think it's a question of whether I leave the strategy discussion to maybe more of a Q&A format. Well, let me tell you a little bit about it for now. I'll like sort of whet your appetites, and if you're interested in more, I can say more. I obviously like to talk.
Thank you.
So I'm happy to keep talking about this in Q&A. And once we pivot to Q&A and I can take my eyes off the screen for a second, I'll drop an absorption form link in the chat so folks can sign up for the campaign if they're interested in being involved. You can also just email me or get me on Twitter or whatever. There's lots of ways to contact me if you're interested in being involved. So what the DSA campaign is doing nationally, and the reason that it's a national campaign, I should note, is because our kind of analysis in the Eco-Socialist Working Group, which is, by the way, I think the largest national working group in DSA in terms of how many members we have, like maybe like 1,500 members of this working group. The way that we've kind of thought about it is that at this moment in history, given the political landscape and given the climate reality, we have to push for federal demands. So, meaning, I love local Green New Deal work, and I seriously mean that. I love it with a passion. I think what's really cool about the Green New Deal is that it scales to different scales. So you can do local Green New Deal projects, state level, national, and I'll talk about when I get to it, global Green New Deal work, right? So it's something you can think about at all scales, but at this moment when we have, though an extremely disappointing one, but we do have a Democrat in the White House, and though a very razor thin margin, we do have a Democratic control of Congress, right? And the climate clock is ticking. And in fact, it's ticking every time there's a new study, it's like ticking faster than we thought it was, right? Because there are all these threshold and feedback effects that scientists, are still discovering. And so the climate scenario is actually just getting worse as time goes on. And so all of those things combine to say that the US is one of the largest global emitters. It's the largest per capita emitter, meaning we use the most energy and have the most emissions per capita compared to any other country. We have an enormous climate debt because we have emitted so much over the past few hundred years. And we have this political opportunity of finally not having Trump in the White House. So I think, the sort of political analysis in DSA has been, this is the moment to press for national demands, which doesn't mean you leave your local work aside. I think there can be all sorts of synergies between different scales of political work, but it does mean that we should take advantage and not shy away from using our power as a national organization. We're the largest socialist organization in US history for several decades now, right? And so we should sort of use that national power, which is just all of our members and all of our chapters in totality, and sort of push at the levers of decision making in DC and press for real policy demands that would hopefully put us on a path towards climate safety and towards more economic equality. And so that's the really broad kind of theory of power of the national Green New Deal campaign, that we should focus on federal demands. But then the question arises, and I'm just going to pick back up the thread that I was kind of saying before, of what's the constituency? Who are we organizing? Are we organizing climate activists? Are we organizing these community members? Are we organizing in specific states or districts? How are we actually going to create a national movement with the leverage to successfully push for really radical demands, transformative demands? Like the Green New Deal, I kind of laid out a little bit, gave folks a little bit of a taste of it's a major transformation of all areas of life in order to make them more economically equal and also much lower carbon. So that's a big historic task. Again, we could compare it to the New Deal. We can compare it to World War II. I actually think those comparisons pale in comparison. I mean, we're doing something that's much more than either of those ambitious moments in policy history did. So the question is who's going to accomplish this? I think as socialists, we don't expect just some smart enlightened policymakers to do this for us, right? And I think as serious socialists, we also don't expect just spontaneous movements of people that appear out of nowhere to suddenly be at the gates demanding that policymakers do this. We know that organizing is a process, right? And that it involves ongoing forms of politicization, and it also involves ongoing struggles for demands that sort of ratchet up over time. And so after a lot of discussion within this kind of space of the National Eco-Socialist Working Group and the Green New Deal Campaign Committee, which was created out of the last convention to specifically focus on designing a Green New Deal strategy, we thought, let's get back to basics. What socialists think, and empirical history bears this out, is that we don't have an example in sort of modern history, during and after the Industrial Revolution to the present, of major transformations happening without a militant labor movement. We don't have an example of that, right? And I think that I mean, we could say aside from, I guess, the civil rights movement, except I would say that the civil rights movement and the labor movement and and the Communist Party and, various left formations were also very intertwined in ways that lots of scholarship bears out, right? So basically, we don't have examples of transformation without the people that are most affected, right? Rising up, organizing, and putting leverage where they have power onto decision makers and forcing them into a bind and making them do things. And right now, that coalition for the Green New Deal doesn't quite exist. It exists in our heads and it exists to varying degrees in particular parts of the country, but it doesn't exist in a unified form. And a big missing piece is the labor movement, right? The reason the labor movement is a big missing piece is because, as I mentioned previously, like labor is weak right now, right? And that's not to say that there haven't been some amazing strikes recently. And the Hunts Point strike was like extremely inspiring. The Red for Ed stuff, the UTLA strike that also was kind of at the tail end of that, extremely inspiring. More wildcat, actions, Instacart, Amazon, and these have all had effects, right? I'm not like I love when those things happen, and I love how involved DSA has been. But I don't think we can deny the reality that over time, union density, especially in the private sector, has just plummeted, right? So how are we going to win something that is more ambitious than the New Deal, more ambitious than World War II era economic mobilization, without like a organized labor movement that is strike ready and that is militant and that is connected to socialists, as in the past it was, and that also has the Green New Deal as one of its top demands? I think that's like a real conundrum. And so what we have thought about in DSA nationally is that the first step to winning a Green New Deal is a militant, expanded, more organized union movement that is bringing the full power of the multiracial working class onto, political elites and pressing for demands like the Green New Deal, but also like Medicare for all, also like other things that we can imagine such a movement taking on should it exist. And so this is all to say that our first policy goal in our Green New Deal national campaign is to get the PRO Act passed. And people may know what the PRO Act is, or people may not know, but the PRO Act is the Protect the Right to Organize Act. And it basically dismantles decades of corporate attacks and political establishment attacks on the basic right to organize unions, right? Without fear of retaliation, without really onerous bureaucratic procedures. I don't know if folks in the room have tried to organize a union. It's like not easy in the US. In fact, the US is a place that of the so-called like advanced industrialized world is one of the hardest places to organize a union, right? It's really difficult. And so we think that, step one to winning something like a transformative, radical, eco-socialist Green New Deal is having a labor movement with some muscle that can actually collectively organize and that has these barriers to its own collective capacity removed. And so our first kind of phase of this campaign is to throw all our weight for a 100-day push, because that's roughly the sort of legislative calendar and cycle, to get Congress to pass this right, to this protect the right to organize paradigm legislative package. And it actually already passed the House. The Senate is what's really in question because of the obvious case that we have a razor-thin majority, and that majority includes Manchin and others who may not be very excited about empowering unions. So it's a fight, but it's like a fight that you can imagine winning, which I think is a good first fight to have, right? If you can't imagine the conditions under which you would win, it can become very demoralizing very quickly. But the PRO Act is something we could win. And I think, the question might immediately arise that like, okay, I heard everything you said, Thea, like it's important to have a militant labor movement that's organized in order to win big policy goals, but like, why at all would we expect that such a militant labor movement would join us in this fight for a Green New Deal, right? That's like a very reasonable question, especially since there are specific unions whose workers don't immediately benefit from an energy transition, right? Especially in the fossil fuel sector, in sectors that would probably have to really transform in order to have a Green New Deal. And I think that, that is a valid question, but one of the big impediments to a sort of radical working class kind of based environmentalism in this country has been this perceived, and I emphasize perceived because I think it's simplified a lot and sometimes more perception than reality, but a perceived tension between workers or unions, however you want to put it, and environmentalists, right? And I think that environmentalists, have done things to try to address that divide, but it hasn't eliminated the divide because the divide still apparently exists, at least in the level of political culture. And so we think I'm saying in we because I'm speaking for other comrades that have worked a lot on the strategy, that we need to really go all in on a political project that is alongside labor, show our solidarity, but also in the process, through our union members that are DSA members, do political education work, just like we're doing right here, but in union halls, virtual or otherwise, like actually make those connections through rank and file organizing, among union members, that DSA represents in various industries. Obviously, we're stronger in some sectors than in others, but there are tons of DSA members that are union members. And so the National Labor Commission is doing some of that work. We in Green New Deal Campaign Committee are kind of organizing our eco-socialist and Green New Deal leaders, and we're going to push really big for passing the PRO Act. I'll just mention more briefly, because I think they require less explanation than why would a Green New Deal campaign start with this labor legislation, is that our other two major demands, which we will start to kind of lay the groundwork for during the PRO Act phase, but we'll put much more considered effort into them after this first 100-day period, is a green public bailout. So a massive infusion of green public investment from the federal level, but to invest in states and localities that have been starved of resources and are also suffering in the way that Texas is, with totally out of date grids and lack of weatherized housing and all of these issues that are becoming more and more salient to everyday people. So to have like the federal government, just like it's doing with this big upcoming stimulus, hopefully, but with another round of stimulus that's much more focused on infrastructure, climate, green, and really emphasizes the public piece, like the role of the public sector. And hopefully our eco-socialist kind of slant on this will be a big push for public ownership of the energy system, right, of the grid, just like the public power campaign in New York and other elsewhere in the country has been pushing for. And then side by side with that, and kind of picking back up the thread of labor, is to push for a federal green jobs guarantee. And we've been actually seeing a lot of movement around a jobs guarantee. Ayanna Pressley, the congresswoman, has a pretty cool proposal. Well, it's a resolution, kind of like the Green New Deal one was. It's not a full piece of legislation, but to have a jobs guarantee, she's worked in some climate and decarbonization aspects to that. I'll also note that the jobs guarantee. So I talked a lot about the New Deal, and I want to talk a little bit about the civil rights movement and the sort of long movement for Black freedom, and that the idea of a jobs guarantee really comes from the civil rights movement. These were the ideas that came from civil rights leaders addressing the nexus of racial and economic inequality, and really pushing for the government to guarantee everyone a job. And so you can see Martin Luther King talking about this, among other leaders from the civil rights movement. So I think it's a way to also center racial justice in our Green New Deal work very thoroughly, and also kind of expand the coalition in a variety of ways. So green jobs, green infrastructure, publicly owned as much as possible, and the sort of empower labor. These are like the three pieces of our national campaign. And if you're interested in getting involved, as I said, as soon as I'm not like talking for a second, I'll drop a link in, but there's lots of ways to get involved. This will be launched with a big national call webinar in early March. You're not gonna, this is just the first time you're hearing about it, if it is the first time, and you'll hear about a lot more. It's been going out over the national kind of email listserv as well. Okay, I'm aware of the time. So I'm gonna pivot now to this global justice piece. And we'll bring it all home. We'll make it work somehow. And then I'll try to do less than 10 minutes here because I want to hear your questions. Sorry, I'm missing all these funny things in the chat. That's the problem with being the speaker. All right. So earlier in this, rewinding a little bit, earlier in this conversation, I said that like one of the big challenges as socialists working on climate is getting together that multiracial working class rooted coalition that needs to fight to win for these things, given all of the ways that the dismantling of the labor movement, the repression, of course, of Black radicalism, by the state, all of these intentional ways that coalition has actually been torn apart and weakened politically, right? So that's a big challenge on its own. And then the question of where socialists play a role there is another big question, right? Especially in places and communities where socialists are not, are not like sort of are not super present yet, Let's put it that way. So that's a big question in and of itself. I'm going to sort of pivot us to like another big question, which is that of planetary or global justice, right? So we know that climate is a planetary issue, right? It's sort of obvious as soon as we think about it. We know that, you know, we're talking about atmospheric warming. This is an atmosphere that the whole planet shares. When we also think about other types of environmental devastation, right? Whether it's ocean acidification, whether it's the desertification and drought of large swaths of the planet, we know that these processes are transnational, that the causes and results of them cross national borders. So I think it's fair to say that most people that know something about the climate crisis understand that it affects the whole world and that it's not something that's limited to one place. At the same time that we understand that the global South and racialized communities around the world and indigenous communities around the world bear the brunt of it. I'll come back to that. So I'm not saying it's globally equal in its effects, but it is a global phenomenon. However, I think that, you know, the challenge is that oftentimes when we think of policies like the Green New Deal or just any energy transition, even one that's much less ambitious and radical than the Green New Deal, we tend to immediately like think about a process that happens within national borders. So it's like, okay, the energy transition is something that just happens in the US or it happens in China or it happens maybe in the EU. So that's supranational, but it's still like a bounded place. And what we argue in A Planet to Win in chapter 4, which some of you may have read, and what I'm working on a lot of my own research as well, is to make the argument that for better or worse, the energy transition can't be thought about as something that is bound by national borders. Maybe it would be easier if it could, but it can't. And the reason that it can't is that all of the technology, all of the actual stuff, the infrastructural, concrete, material stuff that is needed to create a renewable energy system, and I'm just talking about the energy sector for now, we could also say to create a decarbonized transit sector, to create green social housing, all of the materials that are necessary to do that and the technologies that are necessary to do that are created under global capitalism, right? We know we live under global capitalism, but we don't always connect these supply chain issues to the Green New Deal, for example. And so what the implication of this is that when we're demanding, like, we need to deploy more wind turbines, or we need to have more electric buses, right? Or we need more solar panels on these roofs, whatever the concrete kind of technology or infrastructure that we need to decarbonize, all of those are made through supply chains. And it's kind of cool. You can look at maps of these that cross the entire world, right? Like one mineral comes from this corner of the world, another mineral comes from that corner of the world. The processing and refining of those minerals happens in a third part of the world. The shipping and logistics to transport it happens in a fifth part. The manufacturing in a sixth part, and then it's exported and it's used in the US. Right. And so all of these things, solar panels, like no matter how democratically owned the energy grid and publicly owned the energy grid in our imagined eco-socialist utopia is, for the time being, all of that is produced in these globally dispersed supply chains. And we need to, I think seriously about how our principles, and I'm going back to something that Jeremy said when opening this conversation, like our principles of equality, democracy, worker power, indigenous rights, all these principles need to, in my view, to be coherent and consistent, apply across those supply chains, right? I don't think it's viable politically or ethically to say we only care about about conditions within the confines of US borders. And we could get into why I don't think that's ethically or politically possible. But just on a basic economic level, it denies the reality of globalized production. So then the really thorny question for socialists is, what do we do about those global supply chains? Do we ignore the fact that, like, for example, the lithium batteries in our electric buses that we want to be publicly owned and fare free so that all workers can afford, don't have to pay money to use our imagined transit system? Do we want to ignore the fact that those lithium batteries are made with lithium that's extracted on indigenous territory in Chile without prior and informed consent, that might be manufactured in factories in East Asia that are still relying on coal, or potentially, and creating emissions therefore, or potentially in China and have forms of concerning forms of worker repression. Not that that's unique to China, but anywhere that these are made, they are probably involve forms of worker repression and exploitation, right? Do we care about the global shipping and the emissions created there? That, so do we actually care about having a coherent and internationalist climate politics that also addresses the production of green technology? And I would argue that we should, for a few reasons. One is, I think, just like the Green New Deal does, a global perspective opens up new possibility for interesting alliances and coalitions. So we could talk about that if folks are interested. I'll leave that aside. Like, what would it look like to have a transnational coalition for a Green New Deal? It would probably have to address some of these issues of green technology supply chains. That's one piece. Another, though, and I'll sort of end with this because I wanted to just speak a couple more minutes before we pivot to Q&A. Another is that I think that thinking internationally about the real harms right now, the social and environmental harms that are involved in producing green technology, that are involved in producing solar panels and electric vehicles, and wind turbines and all of these things, because there are harmful environmental and social processes and forms of labor exploitation that go into all of these products. Thinking about that, I think, gives us additional reasons to fight for, and I'm going to circle back again to something that was said at the very beginning of the conversation, to fight for a less resource intensive form of energy transition that might have more room for, as was said, like public luxury, public leisure, forms of forms of social life and community that don't involve like hyper consumption, right? So is there a way to actually say that we want our energy transition to involve less extraction, not more? Because the way that things are going right now, and this may be news to some people in the room, or maybe depending how much you read about this stuff, it may not be new. We are looking at a enormous global commodity boom just to supply the raw materials to create things like EVs and wind turbines and solar panels, right? A commodity boom is a moment where there's like massive demand for primary commodities and the prices go way up. And we had a commodity boom in the first decade and a half of this millennium, and it was not pretty for Latin America. It involved a lot of rapacious, really intense extraction that affected very deeply indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities in Latin America particularly, but also mestizo communities, and met with a lot of social protests. So we're looking at like a similar cycle of a really rapacious, really expansive resource extraction all over the world in order to make green technologies to solve climate change, right? And that should give us some pause. That should feel like dissonant, and it should, that there's going to be potentially a lot of localized environmental and social harm in order to solve climate, right? And so the question is there a less resource intensive way to rearrange our society so that we can address the climate crisis without a wave of without another huge mining boom, is to put it that way. And I think that there are. And I think for me as a socialist, and I'm curious what other people think, it just gives me more reasons to fight for things like public ownership, like collective consumption, like a reduced work week, like just an ethos of kind of sharing of resources rather than individual and unequal consumption and privatized consumption. I think that, in theory and to a degree in practice, to the extent that we have empirical data on this, a collective consumption and public ownership and less work and less hyper consumption, especially of the affluent society, is one that uses less raw materials. The most rapacious extraction comes in the most unequal, privatized, and individualistic societies like our own. And so I think it's just more reason to fight for socialism, right? But I don't think fighting for socialism alone without thinking about the consequences beyond borders is enough. I think we fight for socialism for all the reasons we want it, but we try to always think about what are the global implications? What are our comrades across borders doing? What are they demanding? Are they saying no lithium extraction on my land? How do we deal with that, right? While we also try to decarbonize transit. And I think we shouldn't shy away from these thorny questions, but I think we should kind of embrace them and think of them as additional reasons to fight for like a pretty fundamentally different type of society than the one that we live in. I did it in 10 minutes. When I said I was gonna see 10 more minutes, I did. That's amazing. That usually doesn't happen. I'm gonna stop. And I've not seen anything in the chat. So if you're saying brilliant things or funny things or questions, just for what it's worth, someone maybe can curate them or I can scroll up. But I'm excited to hear people's thoughts.
Thank you so much, Thea. There was so much information there and so much food for thought. I think we're going to go to a Q&A first among the members of the Political Ad Organizing Committee. And I'd like to start and ask you about this coherent internationalist vision you brought up and said that you would be willing to return to. I just wonder, I believe also that that's what we need, and I just wonder what sort of progress has been made along those lines. If there are like coalitions across borders, if any real action has been taken, any sort of information you could give us along those lines would be great.
Yeah, there is. First of all, I want to say that I think that, DSA, and I know Carrington's very involved in this and people in the room might be involved in it too. DSA has been kind of taking back up the mantle of internationalism that is, obviously key to the history of socialism. Socialism always was conceived as an international, workers movement. And maybe we don't have the exact structures in place right now to sort of bring that international workers movement sort of into being, but at the very least we can like be aware of what's happening across borders and we can start to build relationships, right, for like hopefully a moment in which more transnational worker kind of action could actually be possible, right? And we hope that that happens in our lifetimes and actually during this kind of 10-year period that I mentioned of escalating climate crisis and the need to deal with it. So there is movement on the ground around this, and I've actually been surprised at how fast it's coming together. And I say surprised because I started this project on researching electric vehicle supply chains and lithium, kind of specifically the extraction of lithium to supply those industries like a year and a half ago. And it felt everything was very new then. And so things have developed, faster than I could have predicted. Right now or I shouldn't say right now, for the past year and a half or so in South America, where I've done most of my actual like fieldwork research, there has been increasing transnational alliances between indigenous communities and radical environmentalists and all sorts of folks, scientists and left-wing lawyers and like all sorts of people that are very concerned about the effects of lithium extraction in the Andean region of Latin America. So there's a region, it's called the Andean region because the Andean mountains are run through it. They're really beautiful and tall. Anyway, we're looking at the sort of territories of Bolivia, of Argentina, and of Chile. And there's like a transnational zone that kind of overlays those three countries, corners of those three countries. That's it's called the quote lithium triangle. I don't really use that term because it reduces the whole place to a commodity and the activists don't like it. So I respect that. That's what it's called in like the popular media. So I'm just referencing it. But it's this Andean plateau region, and across those borders, despite lots of obstacles, not even to mention COVID right now, making everything impossible around organizing, but despite a lot of obstacles, it's really hard to organize in rural, marginalized spaces that have faced multiple forms of marginalization, both class, ethnic, in terms of indigeneity, and are really suffering in a variety of ways in terms of state neglect and environmental harm. Those communities have been coming together bit by bit to contest lithium extraction in their territories. And I think that's really interesting, and it's something I keep an eye on, and I'm sort of involved in some of that work, from a distance now. But that's really inspiring to me. That's one piece. Let me go all the way to Europe, unexpectedly maybe, because something I didn't mention because I was already, as Carrington said, too much information, and I know that there are limits to how much folks can easily absorb in like a short period, but something I didn't mention that's an interesting development in the world of green technology extraction is that countries in the global north that for many years have just outsourced that extraction to the global south and said, we would love these minerals to be extracted, but can they please be extracted where we consider people disposable and like, we racialize and we just like, externalize onto other places in the world where this mineral extraction happens. That's been the trend for many decades under neoliberal globalization. But that trend is starting to reverse. So a little bit, I don't want to say reverse, it's starting to shift. what's happening is we still have a lot of extraction in the global south and a tremendous amount of socio-environmental harm in Latin America, South Asia, Africa, in the places that are generally referred to as the global south. But we also are getting more extraction in the global north now. And in fact, in a way, like we could even think of the fracking boom in the US, the oil and gas boom that made the US the #1 oil and gas producer in the world, as like a preview. Because that was often done under this banner of like energy security. We need to have our own energy, so we're going to frack here. And so what that did was subject a lot of communities in the US to forms of environmental harm that were new, right? That used to be, right. So you get the idea. So what's happening now is something similar with so-called critical minerals. What critical minerals are minerals like lithium and cobalt and rare earths. They are minerals that are needed for green technologies that are considered like the most important avant-garde kind of thing that capitalism is producing. And these are the critical minerals that go into producing these technologies. And what policymakers are doing in the EU and in the US and in the UK is saying, we want to extract these critical minerals from our borders, from within our borders, because we want to control them. Why is that? Well, we could think about the geopolitics and the rapid economic ascent of China. That's one reason, which is, so there's a lot of like sinophobia. It's, fancy word for like fear of China, right? And so there's a lot of kind of framing that's anti-China, which is to pay attention to. But even beyond that, there is this concern that the world is so turbulent, especially like the trade wars, COVID, all of these like legitimacy crises in liberal democracies. The world is so turbulent that we need to like secure these supplies within our borders. We can't be dependent, quote unquote, on other countries to import them. And so what we're seeing is an uptick, and I could show you a map, but I didn't prepare it. But again, all this information is out there on the internet. We're seeing an uptick in extractive projects linked to green technology in the global north, across Europe, in the US, in the UK, and in Canada. And what's interesting, and now I needed to just put that context in, but now I'm going to quickly answer just the last bit of your question, Carrington. So we're seeing some interesting stuff in Latin America, as I said. We're also seeing the emergence of, I want to just be tentative, like the nascent sort of emergence of a transnational anti-mining movement in Europe, because there are a bunch of new mining projects. Because lithium, by the way, is everywhere. It's actually an abundant material, but it's been historically mined in particular places for various reasons. But there's a bunch of lithium in Europe, as there is in the US. And so there's protest happening against and Portugal has been a hotspot. It's interesting that it's Portugal, which is kind of like a poorer country and it's kind of a semi-periphery of Europe. And has, faced all sorts of like, issues, been oppressed in various ways by the European Union. We could get into that. But in Portugal, there's a bunch of lithium mining projects and they have been stalled at various junctures because of community protests. So there's like these different hotspots of protests around the world and different forms of transnational alliances emerging. They're new, but I think that, to Carrington's point, we should pay attention to them and think about how we are in alliance with them as we are pushing for rapid decarbonization in the US.
Amazing. Thank you so much, THEA. And I hope there'll be a lot of developments on the transnational front. We have a lot of people on Stack and the Stack is now open. So next up is Obi. Obi, is your internet connection okay? Okay. Obi was having trouble today. We'll go to Lee. Let me see.
Sorry. Sorry.
Oh, good. Thanks.
I really appreciate that you have underlined the connectivity between national and international, between local and, general, all these things are all connected. And it's great to understand them. And I think understanding those connections are really key, but we can't let that not allow us to focus on day-to-day work that's focused and coherent and use our resources in a way we can. So, to me, I think right at this moment, people are sort of fascinated by the situation in Texas with the grid and, the total incompetence and, knuckling under to the, rich companies and what that has done. And then looking to the sort of local situation to use that example to get people to fight locally. So here in North Brooklyn, there's a pipeline that we've been fighting, and sort of a nascent fight to, take over the various public utilities, et cetera. And I would just think that that would be a good nexus, because all these things are always important, the public imagination gets taken up by these kinds of situations. Texas being just a crazy situation where, there's a combination of them appropriating and vilifying our ideas at the same time. And, so though I think what you're saying is good, that we have to understand all these parts and put them all together, we also have to come up with local focuses and situations where we take things that local people do and point to them for everyone to see and understand. And also in that context, when we talk about Texas, the situation with the border and the potential change for the immigration system on our southern border is also very important. And a key connection is our connection, the US connection to Mexico and Central America. So I think those are things that the DSA can really focus in on, while understanding all these other things. We can't control everything in the world. And just so my question, I guess, is just on the political thing. Wouldn't it be great, or couldn't we have some sort of a connection with Mexico where we work together with the progressive people there around, specific issues for our continent, for our area, and by doing our work then in that way, underline the international nature of it.
Well, I think it would be
the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah,
Is
I think
a creator of heat for the whole world, one of the biggest. And that's a project that, Mexico and the US has ruined. And so together, maybe we could cure.
I think that it would be great to do more transnational solidarity work, and also, alliances, sort of worker and union alliances across the border. I completely agree that, you didn't quite say this, but I sensed it in your question, that obviously like a major factor driving migration from Central America northward is to Mexico, and in some cases, depending to the US, is, obviously a combination of like awful, disastrous US policies during especially the Reagan period around, the dirty wars perpetrated against Central American people, but also the really intense climate, the way that climate crisis is very intense, right, in the Central American region, especially around drought and making things like subsistence farming impossible, right? So there's all these ways that climate and migration are bound together, and that migrant justice is climate justice, and sort of vice versa. A long time ago in my earlier political life, I did a lot of specifically Latin America solidarity work that sort of took a transnational view of issues like trade, migration, climate, worker rights, et cetera. And we created a lot of relationships across borders. So this was based on the West Coast, a little closer to where you're talking about, between, like, for example, militant unions in Mexico, and actually like building trades unions that were actually pretty left wing in the context we were working in Portland, Oregon, and migrant farm workers in the Northwest. And we did a lot of that type of work. So it can be done. It has been done. It's hard to work across borders, especially in a context of xenophobia and what the Trump administration has obviously done and instilled fear in a lot of people. But you're asking such a big question. I'm not quite sure where to begin. I guess on the first point, I think that absolutely the local projects around democratizing the grid. In Providence, DSA, where I'm based, we had, I think, the first public power project in DSA in terms of a campaign. I'm like a big advocate of those, and I love the public power work. And I think, the best thing, that lesson that folks, comrades around the country can take from Texas is, of course, support your comrades in Texas and communities in Texas, and all of that is very important, and bring light to the issue. But as you're saying, Lee, like bring that back, those lessons back to your own community, in terms of like, Texas is just showing the future of everyone if we don't have a grid with real public investment, weatherization, real capacity, renewable energy, and much more public oversight, but hopefully actually public control and ownership, right? And so I basically agree with everything you said, co-sign. And I don't think that, I don't want people to take away from my talk that like every second of every moment you have to think of every scale of the climate crisis and capitalism and how they intersect. What I'm saying is that that's a perspective to take on our local struggles, right? We can think about our local struggles as a piece of a planetary struggle, and that actually can be inspiring and interesting and open up, like Carrington was saying, possibilities for relationships across borders that we didn't think about, or can at least be a learning experience. Like, how can we draw on the experience of struggles elsewhere for our own? Like, I know it can be overwhelming, and believe me, I feel this every day, to sort of sit with the interconnectedness of the world. But, I don't think siloing is an option. So we think about what is the chunk of this, big problem that we're biting off in our community, or, sometimes we mobilize nationally, right? So sometimes we are involved in something like a national movement that's super local. So, I think that there are different moments for different scales of struggle, but also that whenever you're doing one thing, it has consequences for elsewhere. And I think that can be just kind of something to take home from what we've been talking about. Yeah, sorry. Next person on staff.
Thanks. Thank you. Thea, what do you think about doing 3 questions at a time?
Sure, please. Yeah, I know I'm terrible with talking long at questions, but it helps if I get a few, and then I'll be more succinct for each one.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks. And also, we neglected to go over our community agreements, which we usually do, and we'd like to ask people to keep your questions to like under a minute. So next up, Obi is going to try again, and then followed by Doug, and then Eva.
Oh, sorry about that. I didn't know I was okay. Hey, thank you for the great presentation so far. My question is, I personally feel like the biggest obstacle to progress is the Republican Party. That's just how I see it. If Nixon gave us the EPA, the current Republican Party is like a death cult. And since humanity just dodged a bullet literally without Trump not getting reelected, what should we do about them and their voters?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll let the other two stack on, and then I'll circle back.
Thanks. Doug?
Yes, sorry, I was muted for a second. You often hear leftists say that capitalism really can't solve the climate crisis. Do we know this for sure? Capital might not do it of its own, but with strict regulation, incentive pricing, R&D subsidies, technology adoption subsidies, other interventions, is some sort of solution under capitalism possible? Couldn't some capitalists actually make money in the transition? Do we have time to wait for the dawn of socialism, or do you find this unimportant or uninteresting question?
Thanks. And Eva.
Hi, thanks for being here tonight. I've taken a lot from this, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. So my kind of question was, what would be the result of heeding the requests of indigenous people not to mine resources in their lands? Would it make the transition to renewable energy impossible and direct us back to fossil fuels? Thank you.
What great questions. I really appreciate them. And so quickly, Obi, I agree about the Republican Party. They're a huge obstacle, and unfortunately, because of various unforced errors made by Democratic leadership, the leadership of the Democratic Party at various moments in recent history, and of course in further back history, the margins are much tighter than they should be, right? Like, for reasons that are probably, you know, I don't need to tell this to a bunch of socialists, but our political system is extremely unrepresentative to begin with. So, and then in addition, like undemocratic, we have the Senate, the Electoral College, X, Y, and Z. In addition, like the Democratic Party has had these terrible political strategies and political ideas about how to win elections. And so the combination is that our federal political system is like quite unrepresentative of just where people are even at nationally in terms of political preferences. Not to say that there aren't Republicans, there are, and there are some very right-wing Republicans out there, but there aren't as many as one would think based on the people that are elected to office, because it's just very counter-majoritarian, especially the Senate. And so, but that doesn't make the problem go away. The fact that like these people have to rely on all these counter-majoritarian sort of institutions and gerrymandering and other techniques and voter suppression in order to get elected doesn't make them not elected. They are elected and they're there, and we have to deal with them. I think that there are different ways around this, and there's no magic solution. One is to just flip the script a little bit on your question, which is to focus first and foremost on the Democratic Party. And the reason that I say that, like to target them, right, with our protest, with our anger, with our demands. And the reason I say that is because, we definitely can't rely on Republicans to pass any of the stuff that we want, but unfortunately we can't rely on all the Democrats either, right? And they are more accountable to us because we are, more in the sort of demographic and constituencies of their voters. And in many cases we are their voters, right? And so I think that, first we need to like put the direct pressure on Democrats in federal office that ostensibly are amenable to that pressure and accountability in theory, right? And if every single senator would vote for a Green New Deal and Harris would break the tie, we'd have a Green New Deal. But the problem is there are like multiple Democratic senators that will not vote for anything like a Green New Deal, right? And so I think, it's too ambitious, I think, for like DSA members to think that they're going to like convert really right-wing Republicans, as ordinary voters, let alone like these elected representatives that are hanging on to power with every anti-democratic means possible. I think we have this benefit of this razor thin, but still there majority, and this Democrat in the White House, and we should just target them with all of our might. Now, that's just like my strategic inclination. The other thing that I would say though, is that we shouldn't confuse voters with politicians. And I think as socialists, we should really not do this, because we know that, lots of ordinary voters voted for these terrible mainstream. Someone needs to maybe be muted, or I can actually do that. Wow, cool. Okay. Some of these, I didn't know I had that power. We shouldn't confuse ordinary people with politicians. Otherwise, we would think that everyone that previously voted for whichever incumbent the squad defeated, loved that person, but they didn't, because they voted for AOC or they voted for Cori Bush, right? So we shouldn't confuse voters, and we shouldn't actually do that on the Republican side either. Now, it's a little harder, and it's harder to convince folks that are more conservative to get on board with things, but believe it or not, opinion polls show that on several issues of direct relevance to the Green New Deal, Republican voters are amenable to our policies. I'm not going to say on a totally radical Green New Deal, no. On socialism, no. But on specific policies, yes. First of all, Republican voters support this huge economic stimulus that Biden wants to do. And in fact, there's front page articles in the New York Times that say that Republicans in office, Congress and the House and Senate, are worried about the fact that their voters obviously want them to approve this $1.9 trillion, in their view, quote unquote, handout, right? Okay, so that's you see how these pressure points can align. Another thing that Republican voters are much more in favor of than their elected representatives is actually investments in renewable energy, right? And in especially renewable energy projects that bring clear economic benefits to local communities and rural communities, right? So there's interesting history of Texas. Let's go back to that case, which is all in our minds, of it reached a limit and it didn't go far enough, but there was a moment of major expansion of wind power in Texas. And Republicans were a big part of that story. Their rural constituents liked the wind turbines because they brought jobs and some economic revitalization and just some activity in rural areas that are super neglected economically, right? So the preferences of constituents don't always align with their elected representatives. So I would say main target is Democrats in office because they're movable and they fear the primary threat. Like Schumer, every night he goes to bed, he's scared of the AOC primary, right? They're scared, that makes them movable. Republican elected people are not scared in that way. They're not scared of a socialist party. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, but they are worried about specific voters, especially in specific constituencies, losing them. And so I think that it's more indirect with Republicans, but we should more directly target Democrats. Okay, Doug. Yes, I subscribe to the Financial Times, and I know that green capitalism is a thing, and I know that you know that. I know that. I'm being snarky, but yes, absolutely. There is a growing whole areas of capitalist investment, and those green technology supply chains are number one, right? Like one of the reasons I'm interested in researching them is because they're an area where there's major financial investment behind them, and also elite policymakers who I don't share politics with at all in the EU, in the US, in the UK, elsewhere, are also in forming close alliances with green capitalists, we might call it, and pushing a particular vision of a green capitalism, of technological kind of fixes to the climate crisis, of new forms of consumption. Like everyone needs to own an EV now, so everyone go out and buy an EV, right? So this kind of nexus of green capitalism and sort of like greenish liberalism, I mean liberalism in terms of just like, establishment kind of liberalism, is a real thing. And it's absolutely true that it would be wrong to say that like capitalism is just like wedded to fossil fuels. Like capitalism is wedded to profit, right? And profit can occur in all sorts of sectors. And in fact, capitalism is quite ingenious at finding new areas to exploit, and new markets for consumer markets and all sorts of things. And green tech is no different from that. But I don't think it's an ultimate solution. I mean, I do prefer a capitalist to invest in a solar energy project than in a fossil project. And I do think we should be able to say that. I mean, it would be just against science to say that we hate when a capitalist invests in green energy. The question is not should capitalists invest in these things, or are they, because they certainly are. It's whether this green capitalist route will address things at the scale of the crisis. And I think that there are a couple of reasons to be doubtful about it. At the same time, that I want to be clear, and I think in a way this is where Doug's question is getting, though he didn't say this explicitly, that I think the terrain of struggle that socialists need to be active on is not primarily fossil capitalism, though we need to resist those projects. And I know you're doing this in New York, like, the LNG plants and gas power plants. We obviously need to resist that stuff, but primarily just like I was saying, our primary target is not the Republican Party, it's the Democrats. Our primary target is actually not fossil capitalism. As much as we need to resist the projects where they happen, we need to really be thinking about how we're engaging with green capitalists, because they are the future, right? And they know they're the future. And if we don't have like an analysis, as Doug is suggesting, of how it is actually possible that capitalism can create profitable markets out of climate crisis and to address climate crisis, then we are just living in history and we're going to be left in that dustbin, right? So we really need to like pivot and reorient and think, on the one hand, what are some of the opportunities that green capitalism opens up? Like, I would rather fight a green capitalist over who owns that solar farm than fight a fossil fuel company to just like not build the fossil fuel infrastructure, right? It's like a fight that has a more progressive directionality to it. And I think that we should, recognize that. That's one thing. But I think that we need to do the fight, right? Basically is my answer to Doug. Like, we can't just rely on just profitability to take us in the right direction. I'll just give two reasons why. One is capitalists hate to strand an asset. Anyone hates to strand an asset, but some people have more assets than others, right? And so like fossil capitalists are not going to just let go of those assets. What they're doing is a really complex game. So I'm thinking especially of the European oil companies, because due to regulation, as Doug brought up, they're being nudged more quickly towards, away from fossil fuels than the American oil companies are. But this is going to happen to American oil companies under Biden, most likely. So they're starting to make more investments in renewable energy. But it's still a really small part of their overall portfolio. It's like under 5%, in many cases under 10%. Sometimes it's more, but those are outliers. So they're making these important, but still like disproportionately small investments in green energy, while they still try to milk the, profits from the fracked gas, from the coal, from whatever it is, right? And then they're also making all these declarations that starting in 2050, they'll be carbon neutral. So they're sort of like doing some greenwashing, doing some real movement of investment while still wanting to profit for fossil fuels. And if there's no like really muscular public policy that says keep it in the ground, backed by movements that say keep it in the ground, we're going to still have an emissions crisis while we get more green energy. And the reason for that, aside from what I've said, is that energy demand is growing globally. So you can do more green energy and do more fossil fuel energy, and there's a growing market for energy. So that there's no, it's not like zero sum from their perspective. They don't have to just like switch totally. They can feed sort of both markets, and they will do that. So I think we do need to recognize that capitalists are changing where they're investing and becoming concerned about green, about climate, but that the speed at which they're doing it and the ways in which profit comes before everything else is not going to meet the crisis. That does not mean that we can only solve climate crisis once we have the socialist utopia. I think it means that we fight for the socialist utopia in ways that are on the terrain of green capitalism and fighting our green capitalist enemies, and hopefully winning things along the way that make green capitalism more progressive and that set the stage for more like legit forms of public and worker ownership. That would be my in a nutshell answer to that. But I think about it all the time, and it's strategically complex. Now let's go to a kind of related point, which actually is the other reason we can't just rely on green capitalists. So I'm going to go to Eva's question. What happens when an indigenous community says, you can't mine these resources on my land? I believe, people can have different opinions on this. It's a difficult set of questions because it kind of makes it seem perhaps like dealing with the climate crisis is opposed to respecting indigenous sovereignty. I would say that we respect indigenous sovereignty. First of all, because as an ethical and political principle, I believe in it, and it's codified in international law and codified in many national laws, though national constitutions, though not usually enforced. But I also think that, as per what I was saying earlier, we don't really need specific lithium from specific places. For example, lithium is in lots of places, including in Nevada, including in California. Again, not to say that we should mine that. We should do the environmental studies and see, what the impacts would be in X, Y, and Z. But there's lithium closer to home, and there's lithium far away, and similar, to varying degrees, similar things are true with lots of these raw materials. Oftentimes we think they're rare, sometimes because they're literally called rare earths, but rare earths aren't rare at all. They're just not. They were called that when they thought they were rare, and the name never changed. In fact, the US used to be the #1 producer of rare earths until like the late 90s or early 2000s, when blanking on the name of the mine in California shut down due to environmental concerns, and it sort of then suddenly China dominated rare earths, but it was like the US had dominated it before, and then we shut it down. And that Mountain Pass, I think, is the name of the mine. Now we've reopened Mountain Pass, right? But rare earths can be mined in lots of places. All of these things can come from lots of places, and I don't think there's ever a reason to like violently impose mining on a community. It doesn't go well. It just generates conflict. It generates all sorts of problems. And usually if communities resist something that vociferously, it's because the environmental impacts are that bad. Lots of communities actually live with mining, which doesn't mean that the environmental impacts aren't bad, but usually when you have very militant protests, it's because there's very serious concerns about harm. And there's very little in the way of regulation to actually prevent that harm. I think that if communities are convinced that the environmental questions are addressed, that their rights around consultation and consent have been respected, that maybe they even have direct economic ownership or benefits of the project, there are ways for mining to move forward in ways that are equitable and respect rights. But if a community outright resists it, I don't think that that's the end to green technology, because these minerals can come from many places. But I do think there should be really rigorous standards across the board, and that we can have those rigorous standards and still create green technology if overall we take a position of reducing how much total we need to produce. And so that brings up questions of resource intensity, maybe even more radically of degrowth, which we could talk about. But I do think, I don't want to say we can have it all, because we can't have it all, but I do think that like our values can, be complementary, and we can respect indigenous rights at the same time that we address the climate crisis. And in fact, I think many indigenous movements and scholars have suggested that we can't actually address the climate crisis without respecting indigenous rights, since those are the peoples that have actually protected the land the most. And there's lots of scientific research that shows that where indigenous peoples live and have actual territorial sovereignty, there's much more biodiversity, and the natural carbon sinks are doing their thing. So there's no reason to counterpose those, even though, Eva, I like your question. I'm not saying your question is bad, but I think that that these things can all fit together. We just have to kind of think, intentionally about them.
Thank you. And Thea, are you good for a few more questions? I see at least 7 more people on stack, but maybe you have a threshold.
I will. So I should probably go around 8:30, just to start cooking my dinner. Sorry, but I could stay a little longer. I could stay till like 8:35. Why don't you, if you want to do at random a popcorn thing, like 3 or 4 of those questions, and we'll see how long. I will go shorter now that I'm looking at the actual clock. And I did also,
okay.
just so folks know, I'm going to put it again. I did put the sign up form if folks want to get involved in that national campaign. I'm going to do it again. Okay, go ahead, Carrington. Sorry.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I have Arsha, Mia, and Jeremy.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for everything, Thea, and that was a great lecture. And also, my question is in regards to architecture lobby and
Cool.
the work that we did, because I know the longer story, I just want to make this quick, is that before even the new Green Deal came out, and when Jill Stein was running for office, and we were a bunch of the concerned activist students that went to Jill Stein when she came to Rutgers in New Jersey, and then kind of asked around and made her to like make a promise for the Green New Deal. Long story short, that turned out to be this like movement, and eventually that's what we have. The problem is we also adapted in the architecture lobby, and then we try to make this into like a policy type of form, regulation within the architecture industry, and then it's already there, like the net zero and sustainability. I think my biggest problem was over the years with it is like that it's not very clear exactly the policy wise, like in a, I guess, technocratic sense, that how's that's going to implement it by, let's say, our industry. And I think the decision that we came to agree on as architects, maybe it's been like 2 years or 3 years now, is that like we definitely need a union. Like that's the only way we can force actual change. Not really so much so of a policy like nonprofit style of how it used to be this past, I don't know how long it's been, like 10 years.
Arsha, we're asking people to keep questions
sorry.
to a minute.
Yeah,
Can you
that's
wrap
I
it
just
up?
wanted to see like the difference between these two. That's it.
Thank you. Mia, and then Jeremy.
Cool, thanks. My question is pretty brief. It's just kind of more on the topic of power also, and like what you mentioned about the political moment we're in, the political situation. And I was wondering if you feel like there are indicators that, or like positive signs that the Biden administration is serious about addressing climate change.
Yeah.
Thanks. And Jeremy.
My question's related, which is, I mean, it seems like, word is that Biden plans on doing an infrastructure thing as the next reconciliation. So I'm wondering, like, is there legislation in the works for like what the left is going to try to push as the part of that infrastructure package for, transportation, for construction, for grid? Do we have a sense of what I was going to say red lines, but maybe green lines is better, what the green lines are that we're going to be then holding Democratic legislators who'd be potentially voting on that package to account to and trying to push? And it's sort of related to that, I guess, is the question of like the kinds of jobs that we're looking at being created. Like one complaint I've sometimes heard from like labor people about Green New Deal and jobs is, well, a lot of construction jobs are like short term. They're not like, coal mining or whatever, which is like potentially a job you have your whole life. Construction jobs are usually shorter term, shorter projects. So is there a thought about like how to think about how to use an infrastructure package to then push those people who would be organized potentially through that to then demand like something like a jobs guarantee or something like, more permanent employment, that sort of thing.
Thank you. Well, all the questions kind of connect. Arsha, I know you kind of got cut off by the time limit of the question, so I wasn't sure. I love the architecture lobby, and I'm aware of it, and I have friends that are involved in it. And I think it's really cool for architects, left-wing architects, to conceive of themselves as workers and as a union, and to kind of exercise power in that way. And I think that your intuition that that's the only way to kind of have an effect on policy, rather than a kind of more technocratic, like we're experts. I mean, that's kind of where I heard you coming a little bit, that obviously with professionals, with professional groups, there can be a sort of, we're technocrats, but kind of instead leveraging, we're workers, and we have a kind of a material stake in this outcome. I think is cool. I don't really have much more to say about it, because I'm not an expert in those areas, except that I like the work that the architectural lobby does a lot. I will go to Mia's question and Jeremy's question, which are kind of similar. I mean, or rather, they're connected to one another. I do think that, I mean, there's no point to try to get into Biden's head. Who even knows, right? I don't understand where the hell he has been with this Texas thing, and like the most obvious opportunity to A, be presidential, and B, explain the climate crisis and the energy crisis to people. But he's like barely made a public statement. It's just so disappointing. I can't even imagine but what is going through their heads. So I'm not going to try to get into his headspace and figure out what he really believes, but certainly he is shifting with the political winds, which is something that people have always said about Biden, right? He is, in some ways, you could call him a conservative Democrat, but he's also sort of been where the sort of center of the Democratic Party has been, and he sees that center has moved left. And this, I'm like recycling New York Times analysis. We all know this, right? So I don't think I'm saying anything novel here, but I think that he has made certainly more of an effort. And I don't know if all of his like antagonistic interactions with like Sunrise activists, because he was so intense and rude to them whenever they would like, kind of like get him at campaign stops and try to get him to commit to a Green New Deal, he would just like totally brush them off. But I don't know if that's what made an impression or something else, but something sunk in, because he did decide to prioritize climate and green infrastructure much more so than he had in his prior political career, or even during the primary campaign. So his climate policies between the primary campaign and the general election like changed a lot dramatically, mostly in a good direction, not enough and whatever. And so, Bernie had if we remember from the primary days, like a $16.3 trillion climate plan, and Biden has like a $2 trillion, where the 16 trillion was over 10 years. Biden's is like maybe over 4 years. So whatever there, but it's much less than Bernie's, but it's much more than he agreed to during the primary. So, and a lot of that his proposals to spend money on climate specifically have to do with green infrastructure, and actually with electrifying transit in particular. I think some of his climate appointment, I'm sorry, I'm going back to Mia's question, and then I'll come back to Jeremy's. Some of his climate appointments have been good. Some of them are underwhelming, sort of like Obama, leftovers or whatever. It's a mix. I do think that certainly he's taking it more seriously, and I do think that that's a positive sign. But I think that also, like I was saying before about targeting Democrats, and the number one Democrat to target is Biden, that we should hold him to account on all of these things. So let me give you one example. He said during the general election campaign that he wanted to invest $2 trillion in climate related, energy investments, and that 40% of those investments should benefit disadvantaged communities. We usually say frontline communities, right? And it's like that 40% talking point has kind of like dropped off the radar. So like, is he really going to do this? Meaning, is he really going to create a pathway for investment that is public federal money that is targeting in a substantive way communities that have suffered the most from the climate crisis, which just means working class communities and communities of color? Like, is he really going to do that? Who's going to hold him to account? I am a little mixed on like how much the climate movement, even the left wings of it, are really like holding him accountable on these things. So I think that, we look for those gaps between statements and actual policy, and we push on them, because actually the statements, while not good enough, are better than we've had ever in climate policy. So we might as well hold him accountable to those, to the money, to that $2 trillion at least, and to like the targeting of it, and to make sure that targeting is real, because we know in our means tested terrible welfare system that like targeted policies are often just policies that actually don't get to where they're supposed to go, that are really onerous on the actual communities that are suffering to actually access those resources. So I think pushing him about real pathways that really channel money towards the communities that need it the most is like is a place that socialists and the broader, you know, movements that we're a part of can really hold the line on. I do think that he will try, as the newspapers report, for a big green infrastructure bill. And I think there are green lines or red lines. You know, we should be very, you know, read those line items very carefully around things like highway expansion. Like there's no need for more highways in the US. We should repair crumbling roads where people really can't get to. I mean, I'm not saying that like we should do nothing about the roads, and like EVs need roads too, but like we should not be expanding our highway infrastructure. We know from like lots of research that the more highways you build, like the more people drive. Instead, we should be really pushing a public transit angle, which so-called Amtrak Joe like should, but he like doesn't really focus on it a lot, but he really should be forced to focus on public transit, especially now that, again, you know, not to keep referring to scientific studies, but they're useful sometimes. We haven't had evidence that public transit is like a major cause of outbreaks of the pandemic. I mean, I know that that can be a concern right now when we're campaigning around transit, but it's not supported by the evidence, and it won't be once folks are vaccinated. So we should really focus on public transit. We should make sure that there's real federal money for like the MTA. I mean, I know that the MTA avoided I'm a New Yorker by birth, you know, so I pay attention to these things a little more. The MTA avoided its doomsday scenario, but it is like nowhere near where it needs to be in terms of investment. So we need to be pushing for investment in public systems that enable collective consumption of shared goods like transit, and make sure that the communities where folks have to take 5 buses to get to work, like get that. I mean, the Second Avenue thing, it drives me insane. Like, why is there not resources going to people that have essential workers? I mean, again, all of these are things that we're familiar with, but these should be what we're mobilizing around with that green infrastructure piece, to make sure that it's equitable transit, right? To make sure that it's green social housing and affordable housing, right? And to make sure that it targets the communities that he says by his own campaign promises are the ones that are suffering from the crisis. And I'm sorry, your jobs piece. You know, I agree with you that can be a critique of construction work. I think there is so much built environment work that needs to happen that I wouldn't get too worried about the temporary nature of it. I think once you're in a union, and once we use public policies to make sure that all of these jobs are union jobs, there will be a steady stream of like retrofitting buildings, retrofitting schools, retrofitting transit systems, installing charging infrastructure, electrifying, wiring things, weatherizing things. I mean, I don't want to make it sound endless, because we hopefully won't have to build this world forever. We can just like live in it at some point, as we say in A Planet to Win. But there's a lot of building to be done. And I think there's a lot of room, not just for union contracts 100%, but also for things like worker cooperatives in areas that don't really have, that aren't as amenable. Like, for example, like solar panel installation. I think that's a place where we can think about worker co-ops in addition to thinking about unionization.
Amazing. So it's 8:32. There's 2 more people on stack. How are you feeling?
Why don't I get them? And if I just need to say, here's a cool article to read on it, I'll do that. But just to not have them not be able to say their piece.
Okay. Thank you so much, Thea. So we've got Nico and Brian.
Okay, I feel guilty about being on Slack now, but
don't feel guilty. It's okay. Go for it.
When I think about the Green New Deal and socialism and the state, I think about other attempts to building progressive power in the global South, like in Ecuador.
Yep.
Like Korea's critics say that mining and extraction is not that cool. So I don't know if you can speak about Ecuador in particular, like the difference between Arauz and Yaku Perez. I'm not really that familiar with it in detail, but I'm wondering if Perez genuinely has a leftist alternative to mining, or if there's any alternative anywhere in South America to extraction.
Thanks, Brian.
Great. I'll take the second one. Yeah, and I'll do them in a row.
Okay. One thing that really intrigued me about your presentation was sort of the idea of thinking about how do we create a politics around a shorter work week? I wanted you to see if you could elaborate on that, because when I think about sort of implementing a possibilities for your grandchildren, for our grandchildren type 15-hour work week world, what I always come back to is the great difficulty is those in power in almost any conceivable world will be those who work 115 hours rather than 15 hours. So how do we go about creating that environment?
Great. I'm being annoying to, is it Miko or Maiko? Sorry. Okay, Miko, I hope I got it right. Your question, because I wrote a book about Ecuador, but maybe you knew that and maybe that's why you're asking me that, I'm not sure. But there you go, you can read my book, which is all about this topic. And actually Yaku Perez appears in my book, but not with the name Yaku, because his name was Carlos then, and I explained in a footnote why he changed his name. But when I interviewed him, his name was Carlos Perez, and he was an anti-mining leader. He wasn't running for president yet. But so I could, we could do another hour on Ecuador. I won't, obviously, for my own sanity, because I do have to do the dinner thing. But all to say that I think that this question of like different left stances on extraction during the pink tide and in this current moment are fascinating, and they're just what I've studied for over a decade. And I think the left should, like I've been trying to say throughout this, like not shy away from difficult questions. Like it is difficult. It's difficult to know that in a place like Ecuador, the left has been divided over these issues, right? I think it's easier to say like one of these two positions isn't leftist, right? That's like an easier position. And that's a position that some of our comrades take, right? And comrades that might be in this room, comrades I respect, comrades that write things in Jacobin, it's one thing is to say Perez, for example, an anti-mining leader in Ecuador, is just not a leftist, right? Now, I do actually think that there are some limitations to Perez's leftism, meaning that I think that he is not as coherent a leftist as I would like. However, there are many indigenous comrades in Ecuador who are anti-capitalist to the core, anti-imperialist, and are also fighting against sometimes left-wing governments on the issue of extraction, right? And so it's not so easy to call into question their leftism. And so we have to take seriously, what does it mean in the US to, on the one hand, try to be in solidarity with governments that have progressive agendas in Latin America, but on the other hand, be in solidarity with movements that are sometimes in conflict with those governments. Now that happened in Venezuela too, not over extraction, which wasn't as the sort of pivot of conflict in Venezuela, but in Venezuela, if you went there in the early 2000s, Venezuelan leftists, socialist communists would first of all say, I support Chavez, but they would also say, we are pushing Chavez every day and we are protesting Chavez because he's not being socialist enough, right? So whenever you go on the ground, the movements are the vanguard, the movements are pushing, and sometimes the movements are in outright conflict with the state. And that creates challenges for solidarity movements based in the US, for example. And we should have a whole other session about that. But I just want to kind of lay that groundwork. Just to update you a little bit, and I know it's been extremely confusing even for me to follow what's happening in Ecuador. Yaku Perez is the indigenous candidate who ran on an anti-extractive platform, is no longer, it looks like, and actually there's someone in this room who knows more than me and has been following this more closely, Andrea, but anyway, it looks like he will not be in the runoff against Arauz. So it looks like what it will be is a more classic left-right divide of Arauz, the Correísta, pink tide, sort of legacy candidate, versus a very right-wing banker, in which case I think the choice is a little bit less fraught, perhaps. But it's not so fraught for indigenous movements and communities that saw their members criminalized under Correa and maybe just cannot bring themselves, understandably, completely to vote for Arauz, right? So, it might seem simpler in some ways from a solidarity perspective to have that right-left, but it's not actually any simpler in terms of intra-left politics in Ecuador, which remain as complex and people are as divided and fraught over voting for someone who they might like some of his policies and I'm sure would say that he's better than a right-wing person, but who a right-wing person would be just as extractivist, if not more, but, has a real problem in terms of this connection to Correa and the certain communities that were very disenchanted by Correa because of the extractivism piece. So it's very complicated. I'm not even going to try to simplify it because I think that doesn't do justice to the situation. If I were advising Arauz, which I'm not, but if I were, I would push him to be much more out front of these issues, to like he, yesterday should have been sitting down with the indigenous movement leadership. I know he's made some attempts, and again, I'm simplifying and I'm just doing this quickly, but I think from day one, because that's going to be a weak spot for him in the general election, in the runoff. And I think he should have gotten ahead of some of these issues. We'll see how it pans out. I think he has a very good chance over Lasso, the right-wing guy, but But these divisions are real, and they're not going to go away by not, sort of talking about them. And I mean that both on the US solidarity side and internally within Ecuador in terms of Arauz's strategy. That's my really quick, but you can look at the book, talk to Andrea, who's also in this room at some point. There's lots of comrades that study these issues closely, and they're super interesting. Shorter work week. I don't know what to say in 5 seconds. When we won the historic working class, won the 10-hour workday and the 8-hour workday and the weekend, it always seemed impossible. I think that, the labor movement for the long durée of its history has always been about working less. And I think we need to actually recover that radical aspiration, right? We often think of labor unions as just valorizing work, but actually they have tried to really win leisure. And I think that's a really interesting history to pick up. There's a big, socialist feminist also angle to that history. There's of course the wages for housework angle on that history, right? So there's a lot of different ways to think about what workers are demanding is more control over their time. And what capitalists are always trying to deny them is control over their time, right? And so that's a tradition to pick back up and fight for more, because with technological advance, but also because of the climate crisis, we can and should work less. And we should just demand it and see where that demand takes us in terms of organizing. Okay, I'm gonna end it there.
Thank you so much. Everybody go get Resource Radicals and read it, because you can see we all have so many more questions. I'm sure many are answered there. Also, I see Andrea, sorry if I mispronounced, but shared a good link reviewing THEA's book, and says that it speaks more to
it brings it up to date with the elections nicely. Yeah. Thank you so
and
much
do you have anything else, THEA, that you'd like to say to us in terms of how we can get involved, how we can take next steps? Just carry on our good work.
I always say, I'm sorry, my computer's going to be slow because it happens when I do Zoom, but you can just Google Eco-Socialist DSA. You can join the Eco-Socialist Working Group. Carrington can tell you how to get involved in the Internationalist Working Group. For those of us that are interested in that kind of work. And I dropped the link a few times to get involved in the National Green New Deal campaign, but you will keep hearing about it. Those emails from Maria Svart often have updates about it. So just stay attuned to that. And I hope to see you all in some other event, virtual and one day real, physical. I miss you all.
Thank you so much, THEA. So please go get your dinner. We just have a few announcements to make, Jeremy.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for inviting me. This was great. I feel homesick. I know Carrington and Jeremy, they know I, visit New York a lot, and I miss it, and I miss seeing you all in person, but it was wonderful to see you this way.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, yeah.
So just a few quick announcements. I dropped the link again for signing up for the National Green New Deal campaign. We have a few links for New York eco-socialist stuff. Signing up for the New York Eco-Socialist group. Also, as part of the general, let's do a lot of tax the rich stuff, because this is the last month of the campaign. Eco-Soc is doing a tax the rich phone bank on Wednesday, and a door hanger shift on Saturday, so people can sign up. Links are there. Tax the rich is the big thing over the next month, so please sign up for phone banks. To get a Green New Deal, to get one step further in New York State, we need money to build out infrastructure for public power, for a number of things that we want to do for transportation, et cetera. So tax the rich, please sign up to get involved. And we have a branch meeting tomorrow night where you can learn more about getting involved, as well as in our beginning our exciting work of organizing through the offices of our electeds. That's tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Then in terms of poly-ed, really quickly, political education, we have this Saturday, North Brooklyn, along with Lower Manhattan and Central Brooklyn, political education is sponsoring a talk, an interview with Corey Robin on Trump and the history of the right, kind of in light of the recent Capitol riots. Corey Robin is a leftist who writes a lot about the right wing in the United States, so that should be very interesting. Please come out for that. And then we have our next night school session in 2 weeks on immigration. And that's with John Washington, North Brooklyn member and Nation writer. So join us for all that. If you're not a DSA member, join DSA, pay local dues to help put on programming and pay for Zoom and things, and tax the rich. And thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to the organizers, and good night.
Thanks everybody.